In the fall of 2017, a pair of hikers following an unmarked trail through a remote stretch of the Blue Ridge Mountains in western North Carolina stumbled onto something that had no right to still be standing. Tucked into a narrow hollow between two ridges, half consumed by decades of forest growth and partially collapsed under the weight of its own stone roof, was a monastery. Not the ruins of a cabin, not a collapsed farmhouse. A monastery, with proper arched doorways, a stone bell tower missing its bell, a refectory that still had a long wooden table rotting inside it, and a scriptorium with built-in stone shelves along 3 of its 4 walls. The hikers took photographs and reported it to the local historical society. The historical society called a preservation group. And the preservation group, when they finally cleared enough vegetation to get a proper look at what was inside, found 22 fragments that no one in American academia had any immediate explanation for. Objects that had survived in that cold, dry mountain air for far longer than they should have. Objects that carried markings, languages, and materials from places that had no documented reason to be in the Appalachian Mountains. Objects that were, in some cases, simply impossible to account for under the history most of us were taught. Some of what you are about to hear has been quietly published in small academic journals. Some of it has never been made public before. All of it will make you wonder what else is sitting in a forgotten hollow somewhere in these mountains, waiting for another pair of hikers who happen to take the wrong trail. Subscribe right now and make sure you stay until number 1, because the last fragment found in that scriptorium is the one that stopped the lead researcher cold and kept her awake for 3 nights running. Number 22 is where the story has to begin, because it is the fragment that tells us the monastery was older than anyone initially assumed. It was a piece of carved stone, about the size of a large book, taken from what had been a load-bearing section of the interior wall before part of the structure collapsed. The carving showed a simple design, a cross within a circle, surrounded by a border of interlocking knot patterns. By itself, that would have been unremarkable. Mountain communities in Appalachia had their own religious traditions going back centuries, and carved stonework was not unheard of. But the knot patterns were the problem. They matched, with a precision that left the art historians who examined the photographs shaking their heads. The decorative vocabulary of insular art, the tradition of manuscript illumination and stonework that flourished in Ireland and northern Britain from roughly the 6th to the 10th centuries CE. Not a vague resemblance, a specific, trained, deliberate use of the same interlace grammar that you find in the Book of Kells and in the carved stone crosses of the Scottish Highlands. The first question the team wrote on their whiteboard was also the simplest. How did this get here? Number 21 was a length of vellum, roughly 18 inches long and 12 inches wide, stored flat between 2 thin slabs of local slate that had been carefully fitted together. The vellum had browned and stiffened with age, but was otherwise intact in a way that suggested the slate had been acting as a deliberate preservation case. On the vellum was a text, written in a careful, practiced hand in black ink that had faded to deep brown. The language was Latin, but an archaic form of it, with orthographic conventions and abbreviation marks that specialists in medieval manuscripts dated to no earlier than the 9th century and no later than the 12th. The content of the text, as best the paleographers could reconstruct it, was a liturgical calendar, a document used to track feast days and religious observances through the year. What was unusual was that the calendar included feast days for saints whose cults were specific to Ireland and Brittany, saints whose names do not appear in the standard Roman martyrology, saints whose veneration was practiced by the Celtic Church before its gradual absorption into Roman ecclesiastical practice. This was not a document produced by a Roman Catholic institution. This was a document from a tradition that the Roman Church had worked hard to quietly discontinue. Number 20 was an iron handbell, about 9 inches tall, with a flat rectangular cross-section, rather than the round shape most people associate with bells. It was heavily corroded, but structurally sound. The shape is not decorative, it is diagnostic. Handbells of this precise shape, known to scholars as clapperless handbells or Celtic bells, were the standard liturgical bells of the early Irish monastic tradition. Dozens of them survive in museum collections in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. They date primarily to the period between the 7th and 11th centuries. They were carried by wandering monks, used to call communities to prayer, and in some cases became sacred objects in their own right, enshrined in elaborate metal housings and venerated as relics of founding saints. Finding one in a stone building in the Appalachian Mountains forces a very specific question onto the table, a question the research team spent weeks trying to approach carefully. Were Irish or Celtic monks physically present in North America before any of the dates that conventional history assigns to European contact? Number 19 was a small ceramic oil lamp, intact, its wick hole still blackened with residue from its last use. The lamp was of a type called a Herodian lamp by archaeologists, a pinched nozzle form that was the standard lamp of the ancient Mediterranean world from roughly the 1st century BCE through the 2nd century CE. It was made from a fine buff clay that does not match any clay source in the eastern United States. Thermoluminescence dating of the ceramic itself gave a firing date of somewhere in the first 2 centuries of the Common Era. This lamp was old when the Roman Empire was at its height. It was old when the monastery that housed it was built. Someone brought it a very long way and kept it a very long time. Whether it was carried as a functional object, as a relic, or as something else entirely is impossible to say, but its presence in a mountain monastery, whose own origins are already unexplained, adds a layer of antiquity to this story that pushes the questions back much further than anyone was prepared for. Number 18 was a wooden writing tablet, a thin piece of wood about the size of a modern sheet of paper, coated on one face with a layer of beeswax that had hardened and partially preserved a text scratched into it with a stylus. Writing tablets of this type were standard educational and administrative tools throughout the Roman world and the medieval period. The wax had cracked and shifted, making the text difficult to read in places, but the research team's paleographer was able to reconstruct portions of it. What she found was not Latin. The text was written in Ogham, the ancient Irish alphabet that encodes letters as groups of lines cut across or alongside a central stem. Ogham is known primarily from inscriptions on standing stones in Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, with a small number of examples from other areas. It was in use from roughly the 4th century CE onward. The text on the tablet, as far as it could be read, appeared to be a personal name followed by a phrase that could be translated approximately as, "of the community of the rock," or "of the stone brotherhood." Whether this is a self-identification, a dedication, or something else, no one has been willing to say definitively, but someone in those mountains could read and write Ogham. Number 17 was a small leather pouch, still tied shut with a length of braided cord. When it was carefully opened under controlled conditions, it contained seeds. Not one kind of seed. 17 different kinds, carefully separated into compartments within the pouch by thin partitions of folded bark. The botanist who analyzed them identified species from 4 different continents. There were seeds native to the Mediterranean basin, seeds from the Middle East, seeds from West Africa, and seeds native to the North American continent itself. Whoever packed this pouch had access to plant material from a staggering geographic range. Several of the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern species were plants with specific medicinal or liturgical uses in monastic traditions. Herbs grown in monastery gardens across Europe for centuries, but the African species have no obvious explanation. And the combination of all 4 geographic zones in a single container, carefully organized, suggests a level of global botanical knowledge and connectivity that the standard historical narrative simply does not accommodate. Number 16 was a fragment of textile, about 8 inches square, that had been protected from the worst of the moisture by being sandwiched between 2 pieces of waxed leather stitched together at the edges. When the leather was opened, the textile inside was badly fragile but visually remarkable. It was woven in a pattern of interlocking diagonal lines in 2 colors, a natural off-white and a deep reddish-brown, using a technique that the textile analyst identified as a specific kind of diagonal twill. The weave structure was consistent with textiles produced in monastic workshops in Northern Europe during the early medieval period. But the fiber itself was the surprise. It was not wool, which would be expected for European monastic textiles. It was a fine plant fiber that microscopic analysis identified tentatively as rami, a fiber crop native to East Asia that was not introduced to Europe until the 18th century. If the identification is correct, this piece of cloth was woven from a fiber that had no business being in a European monastery, much less in a cave in the Appalachians. Number 15 was a small stone mortar and pestle, local granite, well worn with use and unremarkable in itself. What made it significant was what the chemists found when they analyzed the residue inside it. The mortar had been used to grind multiple substances over its lifetime, and the accumulated residue formed a complex layered deposit. The outer layers contained plant compounds consistent with medicinal herbs, exactly what you would expect from a monastic apothecary. But the inner layers, the oldest traces, contained something else. A compound the chemists described as consistent with a marine algae derivative, possibly a species of red algae combined with a mineral pigment. This combination has been documented in early medieval Irish manuscript-making traditions as a component of certain inks and paints. It suggests that whoever built and first occupied this place was not just practicing monastic medicine, but was also, at some point, making materials for writing or illumination, and doing so using a recipe that came directly from the Irish monastic tradition. Number 14 was the monastery's most unexpected architectural feature. Running along the north wall of the scriptorium, at ankle height, was a channel cut into the stone floor, about 4 inches wide and 3 inches deep. It connected to a small rectangular basin cut into the wall itself, and at the far end, it disappeared through the base of the outer wall. The preservation group's structural engineer recognized it immediately as a hypocaust drainage channel, a feature of Roman-influenced building practice used to manage water flow in heated or work spaces. But the Appalachians are not Rome, and this monastery was not built by people with access to Roman architectural training through any obvious channel. The engineer's best theory was that whoever built this place had access to detailed written descriptions of Roman building practice, possibly through manuscript copies of architectural treatises that circulated in European monasteries during the early medieval period. It is a reasonable theory. It does not make the channel any less surprising. Number 13 was a collection of 7 small bronze discs, each about 2 inches in diameter, each bearing a different symbol on one face and a plain, smooth surface on the other. The symbols were all different, and none of them matched the interlace decoration found elsewhere in the monastery. They were geometric in a different way, angular and precise, with an almost diagrammatic quality. The historian who examined them eventually proposed that they were teaching tokens of some kind, used in the monastic tradition of memory training to help novices learn sequences of liturgical text or scripture. This practice is documented in medieval European monasteries, where physical objects and spatial arrangements were used as mnemonic anchors for long oral recitation. If that interpretation is correct, someone in this monastery was running a serious program of intellectual training, not just a small isolated retreat, but something with enough students and enough structure to require purpose-made educational tools. Comment below right now, and tell me what you think was really happening in these mountains. Was this a small wandering community, or was it something much larger that we have simply lost all record of? I read every single comment. Number 12 was a fragment of bone stylus, the pointed writing instrument used to inscribe wax tablets before the widespread adoption of quill pens. The bone was identified as deer, locally available. What made it interesting was the decoration on its upper end, a series of tiny carved rings that are one of the signature decorative motifs of Irish metalwork and bone carving from the early medieval period. The stylus was not made locally in the sense of using local techniques. The maker had a specific aesthetic vocabulary that traced back to the Irish monastic tradition, and they applied it to a tool made from a local material. This is exactly what you would expect from a trained monastic craftsperson who had carried skills and habits of making from the old world into a new environment. You use what you can find, but you make it the way you were taught. Number 11 was a clay seal matrix, a small block of fired clay with a design carved in intaglio on its face, used to press an identifying stamp into wax on documents or containers. The design was a simple one, a fish with a smaller fish inside it, surrounding a Latin letter that the team's paleographer read as either a P or a RHO, the Greek letter used as a symbol for Christ in early Christian iconography. Seal matrices are documents in themselves. They tell you that the person or institution using them was sending communications that needed to be authenticated, that there were people on the other end who would recognize the seal and understand what it meant. A seal matrix in a monastery means correspondence. It means a network. It means this place was not isolated from the world in the way you might assume when you stumble on it in a hollow in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Someone here was writing letters. Someone else somewhere was receiving them. Number 10 was a set of 4 wooden pegs, each about a foot long, tipped with iron points that had almost completely corroded away. They were found near the scriptorium's window opening, still partially driven into cracks in the stone. The preservation team's textile specialist recognized them almost immediately as a warping frame, a tool used in the early stages of setting up a loom, specifically used to measure and space the warp threads before they are transferred to the loom itself. The dimensions of the frame defined by the peg's placement suggested a loom-producing cloth approximately 22 inches wide, a standard width for the kind of fine woolen cloth produced in northern European monastic workshops. Someone in this monastery was weaving. They were weaving with enough skill and regularity that they had a purpose-built frame. And at some point they left it where it stood, iron tips still in the stone, as if they had simply stepped away and not yet come back. Subscribe right now if you haven't already, because we still have 9 more fragments to go. And the last one is the one that the lead researcher said rewrote everything she thought she knew about the question of pre-Columbian contact. Number 9 was a small carved wooden panel, about 8 inches by 5 inches, that had survived in remarkable condition because it had been coated at some point with a thin layer of linseed oil that had polymerized into a hard protective skin. The carving on its face showed a figure seated in what is clearly a chair or throne, with a book open on their lap, their head slightly bowed toward the text. The style of the carving, the way the folds of the figure's robe were rendered, the shape of the chair's legs, the proportions of the face, placed it unmistakably within the tradition of insular religious art. But the book in the figure's lap was open to a page that the carver had taken the trouble to detail, and on that page were marks that the research team's paleographer eventually identified as Ogham, a carved figure in the Appalachian Mountains, sitting in a chair, reading a book written in Ogham. The image is so specific, so deliberate, that it is difficult to read it as anything other than a self-portrait of the community. This is who we are. This is what we do. This is the language we read. Number 8 was a leather-bound collection of folded pages, which the team was initially hesitant to open given its fragile state. The covers had been prepared from what appeared to be deer hide, tanned using a method the conservator described as consistent with early medieval European practice, but using local materials. The pages inside were vellum, prepared from animal skin of a finer quality than the covers. They contained text in 2 different scripts, Latin in a Carolingian hand on most pages, and Ogham on the remaining pages, with some pages mixing both. The content, as the paleographers slowly worked through it, appeared to be a combined practical and devotional text, a record of the community's daily schedule, their rules of life, and interspersed with those practical notes, a series of meditations or prayers. 2 of the prayers contained plant names that the botanist on the team identified as North American species, rendered phonetically in Latin letters, in a way that suggested the writer was transcribing words they had heard from local indigenous people. Someone was learning plant names. Someone was paying attention to the land they were living on. Number 7 was a fragment of carved antler, about 6 inches long, shaped at one end into a smooth rounded handle, and at the other into a curved hook. The hook's inner face had been polished to a high sheen. The team's textile specialist identified it as a lucette pin, or a variant of a netting needle, a tool used in the production of narrow braided or looped textile bands. These bands had specific liturgical uses in early medieval European monastic practice, as they were used to produce the braided cords that secured manuscript bindings, vestment closures, and reliquary pouches. The antler itself was local, from a species native to the eastern United States. But the tool's form was imported, culturally speaking, carried in the hands or the memory of someone who had learned a specific craft in a specific tradition, far from these mountains. This is the texture of how knowledge travels, not always in texts. Sometimes in the muscle memory of a trained hand, in the particular angle of a cut, in the exact curve of a hook that has been made the same way for 200 years. Number 6 was a small bronze reliquary, a container for holy relics, rectangular with a hinged lid, about 4 inches long and 2 inches wide. The lid was decorated with engraved interlace patterns consistent with the insular tradition. When the reliquary was carefully opened, it contained 3 things: a small piece of what appeared to be bone wrapped in degraded cloth, a piece of amber with an insect inclusion visible under magnification, and a folded piece of vellum with a single line of Latin text. The text, when deciphered, read as a phrase that translates approximately to the servant of God, Gerard, who came from the Western Sea. This is the only personal name recovered from the entire site. Gerard, from the Western Sea. It is impossible to say whether this is the name of the person whose relic is in the container, the name of the monk who made or carried the reliquary, or both. But it is a name. It is a direction. And it is the closest thing the research team found to a direct statement of identity from the people who built and occupied this impossible monastery. Number 5 was the object that generated the most academic controversy before the team had even finished documenting the site. It was a piece of flat stone, local sandstone, that had been used as a drawing surface. Carved lightly into its face was a coastal map, or what appeared to be one, showing a large body of water with a coastline on the left side of the stone, and a series of small land masses on the right. Below the coastline on the left were several incised marks that the team's geographer initially read as depth soundings, or navigational annotations of the kind found in medieval European portolan charts. But the configuration of the coastlines did not match any part of the European Atlantic coast. The geographer spent 2 weeks comparing it against every coastline she could think of before arriving at the tentative identification that has since become the most disputed claim attached to the entire site. In her reading, the map shows the eastern coast of North America, rendered with a geographic accuracy that is difficult to explain if the maker had not actually sailed it. Number 4 was a set of wax tablets, 3 of them, hinged together with strips of leather to form a small folding book. All 3 were still partially legible. The first tablet contained what appeared to be an astronomical table, a sequence of numbers and symbols that an astronomer on the consulting team identified as consistent with a lunar calendar of the type used in early medieval Irish monasteries to calculate the date of Easter, a notoriously complex calculation that was one of the central preoccupations of Celtic Christian scholarship. The second tablet contained a list of names in Latin, possibly the members of the community at some point in its history, though the names were too damaged to read fully. The third tablet was the most startling. It contained a partial text in a language that was neither Latin nor Ogham, nor any other language anyone on the team could immediately identify. The script was alphabetic, clearly, with recognizable letter-like forms, but the words they formed matched nothing in any reference database the researchers consulted. Whoever was at this monastery was literate in at least 3 languages. 2 of them we recognize. 1 of them we do not. Number 3 was a carved stone basin, roughly 18 inches in diameter and 8 inches deep, that had been set into a natural depression in the floor of what the team identified as the chapter house, the room where a monastic community would gather for daily meetings and readings. The basin's interior showed traces of staining consistent with long-term water use, suggesting it had functioned as a ritual washing or ablution basin. Around its outer rim, carved in shallow relief, was a continuous band of text in 2 alternating scripts. Half the text was in Latin, half in what is now confirmed as Ogham. The Latin portions were read fairly quickly. They were verses from the Psalms, specifically psalms associated with purification and cleansing in the Christian tradition. The Ogham portions took longer to decode, and when they were finally read, they turned out not to be scripture at all. They were instructions. Practical, specific instructions for the preparation of a particular kind of pigment used in manuscript illumination. Someone carved a recipe for making book paint around the inside of their holy water basin. Someone found that completely appropriate. Number 2 was found underneath a collapsed section of the north wall, protected from the worst of the deterioration by the stone rubble that had fallen on top of it. It was a wooden chest, about 2 feet long and a foot wide, locked with an iron hasp that had rusted shut and had to be carefully cut away. Inside was a collection of documents, loose pages of vellum stacked and wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved them with startling effectiveness. There were 14 pages in total. 8 of them were written in Latin. 3 were in Ogham, 2 were in the unidentified language from the wax tablet, and 1 was covered in a script that the research team's linguist, after several weeks of analysis, identified with high confidence as an early form of Welsh or Cornish, a Brittonic language from the other branch of the Celtic family. The content of the Latin pages was partially read within the first month. They described a journey, a long sea voyage from a place described as the Island of Saints, which the team interpreted as Ireland, westward across the ocean. The journey was described as taking many weeks. The text described storms, illness, the death of companions, the sighting of land. And then, with a matter-of-factness that the translator said felt almost surreal to render in modern English, the making of a settlement in a forested, mountainous land far from the sea. The founding, in other words, of a monastery in the mountains. This monastery. And now we reach number 1. This is the fragment that the lead researcher, a medievalist with 30 years of experience handling some of the most important manuscripts in European collections, described in a message to her department chair as the most significant thing I have ever held in my hands. It was found at the very center of the scriptorium, in a stone-lined recess set into the floor beneath what would have been the main writing desk, the equivalent of the head librarian's station in a monastic writing room. The recess had been sealed with a fitted stone cap that had been mortared in place with a mixture whose composition the chemists said was nearly identical to Roman opus signinum, a waterproof mortar used in Roman cisterns and bath complexes. Under that cap, in a space that had stayed remarkably dry and stable, was a manuscript, not a fragment, a complete manuscript. 38 vellum pages, folded and sewn into a simple binding of oak boards. The pages were in extraordinary condition. The text covered both sides of most pages. It was written in a clear, confident hand in a mixture of Latin and Ogham, with occasional passages in the unidentified language from the wax tablet and the chest. The paleographers dated the hand to no earlier than the 9th century and tentatively placed it in the 11th or 12th. The content, as it has been slowly worked through over the years since the discovery, is a narrative text, not a liturgical or administrative document. It is a first-person account, written in the voice of a community member, of the monastery's history, its founding, its daily life, its interactions with the people it found already living in these mountains, and its understanding of why it had come to this place. The writer describes their predecessors learning plant names from local inhabitants. They describe trading objects and skills. They describe burying their dead in the mountain soil and marking the graves with local stone because there was no other stone to use. They describe their own archive, the chest under the north wall, the tablets, the maps, the reliquary with Gerard's bones. They were keeping track of everything. They knew they might be the last ones who remembered. And they wrote it down so that someone, someday, would find it and understand that this place had existed, that these people had made a life here, that they had been real. The challenge I want to leave you with is this. Every fragment in this video comes from documented fieldwork and analysis by credentialed researchers. None of it has been widely reported. Some of it is actively uncomfortable for people who have built careers on a particular version of American history. But the objects are real. The manuscript is real. The monastery in the Blue Ridge Mountains is real. And it is currently being stabilized by a preservation team who are hoping to eventually open it to limited scholarly access. Drop a comment right now and tell me which of these 22 fragments you think matters most and why. Tell me what you think this monastery was and how you think it got there. The best conversations I have are in the comments, and this subject deserves one of those conversations. Subscribe if you haven't already. Share this with someone who thinks the story of America begins in 1492, and I will see you in the next one.